London, United Kingdom, October 14, 2009. At exactly 1842 hours, a quiet electrical failure rippled through a substation beneath Camden Town, triggering a cascading shutdown that killed power across a major section of the Northern Line, freezing trains between stations, plunging platforms into emergency lighting and cutting signal feeds inside the control room in a staggered blackout that operators would later describe as abnormal but explainable. To commuters, it felt like another infrastructure problem in a city accustomed to aging systems and temporary inconvenience. To one man already underground, it felt like protection. To a small group of watchers spread across London, it meant a carefully rehearsed plan had just gone live. The man moving through the tunnels that night was known inside intelligence files only as Black Scorpion, a contract assassin whose reputation was built not on gunfire or explosives, but on accidents so ordinary they rarely reached international news. Over the previous 6 years, 8 individuals connected to weapons logistics, procurement networks and clandestine financing pipelines had died in incidents officially ruled mechanical failures. An elevator free fall in Ankara. A generator fire in Bucharest. A pressure valve rupture in Thessaloniki. A basement electrocution in Marseille. No residue, no witnesses, no traceable tampering. Investigators in different countries saw unrelated tragedies. Mossad analysts saw pattern. Black Scorpion did not stalk targets. He did not follow them home. He studied the systems around them, learned which cable carried load, which valve controlled pressure, which backup generator failed first, then made tiny changes that required patience rather than proximity. He positioned environments so physics finished the job. Israeli intelligence first encountered the name in 2006 after a French shipping consultant died when a harbor crane cable snapped under routine load, and a metallurgical review revealed microscopic tool scoring inconsistent with corrosion. The consultant had quietly been moving dual-use components toward Syria. The conclusion was unsettling. Someone was killing without ever standing near the victim. By 2009, Mossad believed Black Scorpion operated as an independent contractor serving multiple clients, trading deniability for high fees, leaving no ideological signature, no claims of responsibility, and no predictable pattern beyond technical elegance. He did not need chaos. He created inevitability. London became his preferred operating environment because no city in Europe possessed comparable layers of accessible infrastructure. Power corridors ran beside transit tunnels. Maintenance shafts intersected with ventilation ducts. Aging systems relied on human trust and routine inspections. For a man who understood engineering psychology, London was a playground. In late September, intercepted communications between 2 European brokers referenced a Scorpion job scheduled inside the UK. No location. No name. Only a reference to underground timing. Mossad surveillance units began quiet pattern mapping rather than physical tails, watching access logs, contractor sign-ins, and CCTV footage for anomalous maintenance behavior. They identified a male using multiple subcontractor credentials who entered electrical access corridors without escort and stayed for unusual durations. His gait matched footage from a suspected Black Scorpion sighting in Milan the previous year, showing a subtle external rotation of the left foot caused by an old untreated fracture. Still, Mossad did not move. Arresting him required certainty. Stopping his operation without capturing him only pushed the problem forward. The breakthrough came from Transport for London itself. During summer upgrades, engineers deployed a remote diagnostic interface allowing temporary adjustment of breaker thresholds for stress testing. It was never meant for permanent remote operation, but it existed, and Mossad cyber specialists quietly confirmed it could be accessed through compromised contractor terminals. This meant Black Scorpion did not need to sabotage hardware physically. He could induce failure digitally, then vanish. Mossad planners realized something else. If Black Scorpion intended to create a blackout as cover for an engineered accident, that blackout could be repurposed. Instead of preventing the outage, they would shape it. Instead of exposing him, they would let him step into darkness that belonged to them. Operation Blackout Net was approved with one objective: capture, not kill. 6 operatives entered the UK separately under unrelated covers connected to infrastructure consulting, safety auditing, and logistics brokerage. No centralized safe house. No visible command structure. Control would be distributed and quiet. A portable thermal acoustic sensor disguised as a cable diagnostic unit was installed inside a maintenance alcove near Camden Town, capable of detecting heat signatures and footstep cadence through concrete. Black Scorpion's walking asymmetry became his fingerprint. On October 14, the intended victim, an unassuming chemical engineer unknowingly supplying stabilizer compounds for missile fuel, boarded the Northern Line at 1811. 6 minutes later, Black Scorpion entered the system from a different station. Both were converging toward the same electrical node. Mossad did not interfere. At 1842, the first breaker dropped. Emergency lighting flickered alive. Trains coasted to silence. The city went partially blind. And deep beneath London, a man who had spent years hiding behind broken machines stepped into a darkness that had already been waiting for him. Black Scorpion had always preferred to work during moments of mild disruption rather than total chaos, because mild disruption preserved predictability, and predictability was the foundation of his craft. Complete disorder produced variables he could not model. That night on the Northern Line, however, the scale of the blackout had not been his design. He had intended to trigger a localized surge affecting a single escalator braking system near Camden Town, enough to stage an accident that would never be questioned. The wider shutdown meant someone else had touched the system. That realization registered almost immediately, not as panic but as recalculation. He did not stop walking. He did not turn around. He did not accelerate. He simply adjusted his route. Surveillance footage recovered later showed him pausing briefly at an emergency signage map, angling his head as if memorizing alternate corridors, then moving into a maintenance passage reserved for authorized personnel. Mossad's thermal sensor inside the alcove registered the distinctive asymmetric footfall pattern at 1844 and transmitted a silent data burst to 3 separate receivers positioned inside different burrows. No voice communication followed. The operation design prohibited open chatter. Every operative already knew their role the moment the fingerprint appeared. 2 movers, positioned inside service tunnels farther down the line, began walking toward pre-selected choke points that narrowed to less than 1 meter wide, locations chosen not for ambush but for control. A third operative, operating as a British rail safety auditor, quietly locked a cross-corridor fire door using a magnetic override that would appear later as mechanical failure. The goal was not to corner Black Scorpion in the dramatic sense. The goal was to compress his movement options until he only had one path left, without him realizing compression was occurring. Black Scorpion sensed environmental asymmetry before he sensed pursuit. He noticed that one maintenance door which should have been open was closed. He noticed a ventilation fan that normally vibrated was silent. These were small things, but small things were his language. Still, the blackout provided cover, and he assumed competing contractors were responding to the outage. He continued toward the electrical node, planning to manually confirm his remote trigger had executed properly. He never reached it. At 1849, Mossad initiated Phase 2. A secondary breaker inside a parallel feed dropped, not causing additional darkness, but isolating a pocket of tunnel space approximately 60 meters long between 2 sealed fire doors. Inside that pocket, thermal sensors showed only one human heat source: Black Scorpion. He was now inside a segment of underground infrastructure that officially did not exist on public schematics, a legacy service spur decommissioned in the 1970s but still physically accessible. Black Scorpion stopped walking. He had reached the point where intuition outweighed plan. The absence of ambient mechanical noise meant he was not alone with the city anymore. He was alone with intention. He drew no weapon because he did not carry weapons. His profession had never required them. He turned slowly, scanning darkness with eyes adapted to low light, but darkness was total. Mossad's movers wore clothing treated with heat-dampening layers that blurred their outlines on thermal imaging, allowing them to approach as indistinct shapes against tunnel walls. They advanced from opposite ends of the spur, not running, not crouching, simply walking. At this stage, the operation still aimed for capture without physical struggle. The preferred outcome was chemical sedation delivered by contact microinjector. Black Scorpion heard footsteps. Not behind him. Not ahead of him. Beside him. The sound profile was wrong. Too controlled. Too synchronized. He stepped backward and raised his hands, not in surrender but in calibration, gauging distance. The first mover closed to arm's length and triggered the injector against Black Scorpion's upper left arm. The needle penetrated fabric and skin with a pressure-driven microcharge. Black Scorpion reacted instantly, striking with an open-hand blow aimed at the throat, but the second mover had already engaged from the opposite side, hooking an arm around his shoulder and driving him into the wall. The sedative entered his bloodstream. It was not fast knockout chemistry. It was designed to disorient first. His perception narrowed. Tunnel walls elongated. Sound warped. He attempted to twist free but motor coordination began degrading. Within 12 seconds he lost fine muscle control. Within 18 seconds his knees buckled. Mossad operatives lowered him rather than letting him fall, reducing noise and preventing head trauma. A third operative arrived carrying a thermal masking wrap that immediately covered Black Scorpion's torso and head, collapsing his heat signature into a dull gray mass indistinguishable from surrounding concrete. The entire physical encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. No gunfire. No shouting. No visible struggle. Above ground, London commuters waited inside stalled trains, checking phones that had no signal, assuming the delay would pass. Underground, a man responsible for years of invisible killing lay unconscious on a floor he had never planned to touch. Mossad did not move him toward an exit. Exits created exposure. Instead, they moved laterally, deeper into infrastructure, using service corridors that connected to a ventilation shaft terminating inside a sealed utility building 2 blocks away. A panel disguised as permanent wall covering was removed. Black Scorpion was transferred onto a wheeled maintenance sled normally used for cable spools. If anyone encountered them, he would appear to be equipment. At 1903, power began partially returning to the Northern Line as automated systems reset. Control room operators categorized the incident as cascading breaker instability triggered by weather and load fluctuation. No one reviewed substation camera footage in real time because substation cameras had lost power too. By the time engineers physically inspected the site later that night, nothing looked wrong. Black Scorpion was already moving upward through a vertical shaft into a city that had no idea it had just lost one of its most efficient killers. The utility building into which Black Scorpion was lifted had once housed auxiliary ventilation controls, but by 2009 it existed mostly as an architectural leftover, its original function absorbed into centralized systems decades earlier, making it ideal for quiet movement because almost no one had a reason to be there anymore. Mossad had leased the structure 8 months earlier through a shell company registered in Estonia that specialized in heritage infrastructure assessment, a phrase vague enough to discourage curiosity and legitimate enough to justify occasional site visits. Inside the building, Black Scorpion was transferred from the maintenance sled onto a collapsible stretcher and carried into a windowless interior room lined with sound-dampening panels disguised as insulation upgrades. His restraints were adjusted, not to maximize discomfort, but to prevent nerve damage during prolonged sedation. The medical officer checked vitals, oxygen saturation, heart rate, pupil response, and airway patency. Everything fell within acceptable parameters. Black Scorpion had stopped convulsing. His breathing was slow, rhythmic, chemically regulated. The operation had moved into its most fragile phase, the one where success could still evaporate without any dramatic confrontation. Mossad doctrine emphasized that capture was only 50% of a mission. Extraction created the remaining risk. London was not hostile territory, but it was saturated with cameras, patrol routes, and overlapping law enforcement jurisdictions that did not require malice to cause exposure. The plan avoided spectacular exits. No helicopters. No armed convoys. No sudden border crossings. Black Scorpion would leave the city the same way sick people left it every day. Quietly. The stretcher was slid into a false-bottom medical transport crate marked with international biohazard labeling and paperwork indicating contaminated filtration equipment destined for incineration. The documentation was real. It referenced an actual private waste processing facility outside Reading. The only false element was the contents. At 1941, a contracted logistics van arrived at the utility building's service entrance. The driver believed he was transporting sealed industrial waste. He had been hired through a legitimate subcontractor chain. He was not Mossad. He did not know. Compartmentalization protected him and the operation. The crate was loaded. The van departed into ordinary traffic. Mossad operatives did not escort it. They had learned through painful historical experience that convoys attract attention. Instead, a single surveillance asset monitored the vehicle's progress using commercial traffic data services and roadside camera aggregation systems. If the van was stopped, the operation would abort and pivot to legal containment under British jurisdiction, a scenario that would cost years but preserve lives. The van was not stopped. It reached the waste facility at 2032. The guard at the gate scanned the manifest, waved the driver through and returned to his phone. The crate was unloaded into a sealed processing bay. Inside the bay, 2 Mossad operatives posing as plant maintenance engineers opened the crate and transferred Black Scorpion onto a gurney. His sedation level was adjusted downward slightly. Deep unconsciousness increased respiratory risk. They wanted him hovering at the edge of awareness without waking. At 21:10, an ambulance from a private medical evacuation service arrived. Its livery was legitimate. Its staff were legitimate. They believed they were transporting a chemically contaminated contractor who had collapsed from toxic exposure. They had protective suits. They had forms. They had no idea who their patient was. Black Scorpion was loaded, covered, and secured. The ambulance departed toward RAF Breise Norton, which regularly hosted international medical evacuation flights. Mossad had not bribed anyone at the base. They had not infiltrated command. They had exploited a standing policy. Foreign private medevac aircraft with pre-approved flight plans and medical documentation were granted expedited handling. The aircraft waiting was a leased turboprop registered to a Swiss air charter company. Its crew believed they were transporting a critically ill industrial worker to a specialized clinic in southern Europe. At 22:54, Black Scorpion was loaded onto the aircraft. At 23:17 the plane took off. Flight path logs would later show a direct route to Sardinia. The plane did not land in Sardinia. 2 hours into flight, it altered course toward international airspace over the Mediterranean. Transponder data was briefly masked during a handoff between civilian and maritime-controlled zones, an anomaly that would not be flagged because such handoffs occurred thousands of times daily. At 2:41, the aircraft descended toward a dimly lit carrier deck of a non-flagged vessel operating under maritime research cover. Black Scorpion was transferred aboard using a stabilized lift platform. The aircraft departed immediately, continuing to its declared destination to preserve paper consistency. On the vessel, Black Scorpion was moved into a medical bay and placed into soft restraints. His sedation was allowed to lighten further. At 3:12 he regained partial consciousness. He did not open his eyes. He did not speak. His breathing changed. A Hebrew-speaking voice said only one sentence. "You are alive because we want information." Silence followed. Interrogation did not begin immediately. Mossad had learned that shock interviews produced unreliable data. They allowed him to stabilize physically, to orient, to feel the reality of capture settle in. By dawn, London newspapers carried brief mentions of a Northern Line power disruption that delayed morning commuters. No one wrote about missing engineers. No one wrote about assassins. British authorities quietly closed the incident as infrastructure instability. Meanwhile, inside a windowless room at sea, a man who had spent his career hiding behind broken machines was confronted with something he had never planned for. Humans. Questions. Consequences. The blackout he had intended to use as camouflage had become the moment he vanished. And for the first time in years, Black Scorpion understood that someone had studied him the same way he studied others. Interrogation of Black Scorpion did not resemble cinematic depictions of bright lights and shouted questions, because Mossad had learned long ago that force creates resistance while inevitability creates compliance. The first 24 hours were deliberately uneventful. He was given water. He was given food. He was allowed to sleep in 4-hour cycles. A medical officer monitored hydration, blood pressure, and residual sedative levels. No one asked him anything. Silence was not accidental. Silence was pressure. Black Scorpion was a man who survived by controlling variables, and now every variable was outside his control. The room had no visible corners, only curved surfaces designed to prevent spatial anchoring. Lighting remained constant, neither dim nor bright. Time became ambiguous. On the second day, a single Mossad interrogator entered and sat across from him without introduction. No file. No photographs. No accusations. Only a tablet placed face down on the table. The interrogator said, "We know how you work." Nothing more. Then he left. Black Scorpion did not respond. On the third day, the same interrogator returned and placed the tablet face up. On its screen was a list of 8 incidents, each summarized with date, location, and official cause of death. Elevator malfunction. Gas leak. Electrical fault. Structural collapse. The interrogator did not say Black Scorpion's name. He did not ask if Black Scorpion was responsible. He simply let the list exist between them. Black Scorpion's eyes lingered on the screen for half a second longer than necessary. The interrogator closed the tablet and left. The message had been delivered. You are not invisible. On the 4th day, Mossad introduced the concept of sequence. A wall monitor displayed infrastructure schematics from London, Marseille, Bucharest, and Ankara. The same structural logic repeated across different cities. The interrogator said, "You prefer systems that fail quietly." Black Scorpion said nothing. Silence did not mean non-cooperation. Silence meant calculation. He was assessing whether denial had value. By the fifth day, Mossad changed angle. They did not talk about murders. They talked about money. They showed transaction webs connecting shell companies in Cyprus, Latvia, Panama, and Hong Kong. They showed currency flows that converged on a set of anonymous crypto wallets. They did not accuse Black Scorpion of owning them. They simply said, "Your clients believe you disappeared." Black Scorpion's jaw tightened. It was the first visible emotional response. Disappearance meant non-payment. Non-payment meant anger. Anger meant people looking for explanations. Mossad understood something fundamental about contractors. Ideology bends. Financial survival does not. On the sixth day, the interrogator said, "We are not interested in you as a symbol. We are interested in your ecosystem." Black Scorpion asked his first question. "What happens if I talk?" The interrogator replied, "You live." No timeline. No promises of freedom. Only existence. Black Scorpion did not immediately answer. He asked for water. The interrogator gave it. The next day, Black Scorpion began describing architecture rather than people. He explained how he evaluated buildings for single-point failure vulnerabilities. How he preferred locations with overlapping safety redundancies because layered systems created more hiding places for manipulation. How he tested response times by triggering minor faults and measuring repair windows. Mossad analysts listening behind glass understood they were hearing a methodology blueprint that had taken a decade to develop. Names came later. Slowly. Reluctantly. He identified 2 brokers in Istanbul who matched clients with contractors. He identified a Bulgarian logistics coordinator who specialized in moving sensitive industrial components through agricultural shipping channels. He identified a Syrian intermediary who arranged payments using construction supply invoices. Each disclosure was verified independently before Mossad acknowledged it. Trust was never granted. It was measured. As cooperation increased, Mossad altered Black Scorpion's environment slightly. Meals improved. Sleep cycles stabilized. Small privileges were introduced. Not as rewards but as signals. Cooperation correlates with survivability. Outside the interrogation room, the intelligence impact began unfolding. Mossad shared selected fragments with allied services under strict compartmentalization. A French counterintelligence unit quietly dismantled a procurement cell in Lyon. Italian authorities arrested 2 shipping executives on unrelated tax charges that concealed intelligence motivations. A Romanian energy inspection revealed equipment tampering that had been dormant for months. Black Scorpion's information was retroactively preventing attacks he had not yet been paid to execute. By the 3rd week, Mossad confronted him with photographs. Not of victims. Of his own access points. Tunnel alcoves. Substation panels. Service corridors. Places he believed only he had noticed. The interrogator said, "You were good. You were not unique." Black Scorpion stared at the images for a long time. His identity had been built on exceptionalism. Being told he was replicable was a deeper wound than being told he was evil. Eventually he said, "You used my blackout." The interrogator did not deny it. Black Scorpion nodded slowly. He understood then that his greatest strength, environmental manipulation, had been mirrored back at him. The thing he trusted most had betrayed him. As weeks passed, Mossad began constructing what they internally called a network inversion map. Every node Black Scorpion identified was traced outward to additional connections. Patterns emerged. The same 3 shell accounting firms appeared repeatedly. The same shipping insurers underwrote high-risk cargo. The same customs brokers processed sensitive consignments. The network was not vast. It was efficient. Efficiency meant fragility. Remove a few load-bearing nodes and the entire structure destabilized. Mossad planners recognized something important. Black Scorpion had never been the core of the system. He was a specialized tool. A scalpel. The real power belonged to those who decided where the scalpel cut. Extracting him had given them leverage, but dismantling his client architecture would create long-term effect. By the end of the 4th week, Black Scorpion was no longer being asked about past operations. He was being asked about future possibilities. Hypothetical contracts. Pending inquiries. People who had approached him recently. He provided 3 names. 2 were already known. 1 was not. That 3rd name would later be linked to a covert attempt to sabotage a European satellite ground station. A plot that would be quietly neutralized before reaching execution stage. Black Scorpion never became cooperative out of remorse. He cooperated because his professional worldview had collapsed. The systems he believed he controlled had been controlled by someone else. For a man who lived by manipulating infrastructure, that realization was existential. He had not been defeated by force. He had been defeated by design. By the 5th week of Black Scorpion's captivity, Mossad had stopped thinking of him as a person and started treating him as a living archive. Not because they had dehumanized him, but because emotional framing introduced bias, and bias corrupted intelligence evaluation. Each session was logged, cross-referenced, time-stamped, and mapped against existing databases maintained by Israeli, European, and select allied services. Analysts noticed that whenever Black Scorpion discussed financial intermediaries, his recall was sharper than when he discussed clients. This suggested a deliberate internal hierarchy. He did not want to know who gave orders, but he needed to know who paid him. Payment chains were his lifeline. Mossad exploited this by steering conversation toward transactions rather than motivations. Over time, a dense lattice of shell corporations, nominee directors, and false invoicing pipelines came into focus. None of the companies were extraordinary individually. What mattered was repetition. The same Luxembourg accounting firm appeared in 8 unrelated corporate structures. The same Cypriot legal service processed incorporation paperwork for multiple front entities. The same freight forwarder ensured high-value shipments that later appeared inside conflict zones. Mossad began feeding portions of this information to European financial crime units under the guise of routine anti-money laundering cooperation. Arrests followed quietly. Assets were frozen. Audits were launched. From the outside, it looked like a financial tightening cycle. Inside intelligence circles, it was understood as targeted disassembly. Black Scorpion became aware that his disclosures were producing real-world consequences when the interrogator mentioned, casually, that 2 of his former brokers had failed to show up to scheduled meetings. No accusation. No threat. Just observation. Black Scorpion asked no follow-up questions. He did not need to. Absence meant arrests or disappearances. Both meant his ecosystem was shrinking. Mossad did not accelerate pressure. Speed created suspicion. They allowed the collapse to feel organic. As weeks turned into months, Black Scorpion's utility evolved. He began offering predictive insights rather than merely historical data. He explained how certain clients preferred specific styles of deniability. Some favored accidents that looked like human error. Others preferred structural failures. Others liked secondary casualties because collateral damage disguised intent. These preferences, he said, acted as fingerprints. Mossad analysts used this concept to reassess unresolved incidents across Europe and North Africa. Several deaths previously categorized as unrelated accidents were reclassified internally as probable targeted eliminations. This did not produce public announcements. Intelligence services rarely announce pattern recognition. They adjust posture. Quietly, security was increased around individuals whose professional profiles matched historical targeting clusters. Some were relocated. Some were warned in vague terms. Some were placed under passive surveillance. Future attacks did not occur. That absence itself became evidence. Black Scorpion also described his client vetting process. He never met end clients directly. Requests arrived through layered brokers who tested reliability using small infrastructure manipulation tasks. If a candidate contractor could subtly disrupt a minor system without detection, larger contracts followed. Mossad realized this meant there existed a shadow recruitment pipeline for specialized sabotage talent. Using Black Scorpion's descriptions, they constructed decoy environments designed to identify other individuals attempting similar probing behavior. Over the next year, 3 separate actors in different countries triggered these decoys. All were quietly intercepted by their respective national services. None made headlines. The network was not eliminated. Networks rarely are. But its growth curve flattened. Black Scorpion himself became increasingly introspective, though not remorseful. He did not express guilt about victims. He spoke about efficiency, about wasted motion, about how most people misunderstood how systems failed. He considered himself an engineer more than a killer. Mossad did not challenge this self-image. Challenging narratives hardened resistance. Instead, they leveraged it. They framed cooperation as continued engineering work. Not destruction. Optimization. Reduction of instability. This framing mattered. Black Scorpion had never seen himself as chaotic. He saw himself as precise. Mossad allowed him to retain that self-concept while redirecting output. The question of Black Scorpion's ultimate fate was debated inside Mossad but never resolved in philosophical terms. Intelligence organizations rarely decide based on morality. They decide based on risk and utility. Public trial was impossible. It would expose methods, compromise allied relationships, and create political crises. Release was unthinkable. Long-term detention under classified authority remained the only viable option. He became, in effect, a permanent classified detainee. No name. No location. No legal status accessible to courts. This was not extraordinary. It was uncomfortable. But intelligence work operates in uncomfortable spaces. Outside life continued. London commuters forgot the blackout. Transport for London filed maintenance reports. Politicians discussed budget allocations. No one noticed that a particular type of accidental infrastructure death quietly disappeared from European statistics over the following 2 years. Analysts noticed. Mossad noticed. Other services noticed. The pattern had stopped. Operation Blackout Net was never formally celebrated inside Mossad. There were no medals. No ceremonies. It became a case study. Training divisions built simulations based on it. The lesson emphasized was not technological superiority. It was conceptual inversion. Instead of asking how to stop an adversary's method, ask how to inhabit it. Instead of disrupting the attack, become the attack's environment. Black Scorpion had spent a decade manipulating systems without touching his victims. Mossad had manipulated a system without touching Black Scorpion until the final seconds. The symmetry was not poetic. It was practical. By late 2010, Black Scorpion stopped offering new information. Not because he had become defiant, but because his knowledge horizon had been exhausted. His world had been small and efficient. Mossad had extracted it. He remained alive. He remained contained. He remained largely forgotten by anyone who did not have a clearance level high enough to know he existed. For a man who had built his identity on invisibility, this was a fitting end. He had vanished into a system larger than any he had ever manipulated. And unlike his victims, he did not disappear suddenly. He disappeared gradually into paperwork, into classification markings, into silence. Operation Blackout Net quietly reshaped how several intelligence services thought about the relationship between chaos and control, not because it introduced revolutionary technology, but because it formalized a mental shift that had previously existed only as instinct. Before London, blackouts, system failures, and infrastructure disruptions were treated primarily as complications, variables that degraded visibility and command. After London, they were reclassified as potential terrain. Training manuals began including environmental volatility as a selectable operational layer rather than an external nuisance. Storms, power outages, strikes, transit failures, and natural disasters were no longer automatically categorized as moments to pause activity. In certain contexts, they became moments to embed within activity. This did not mean exploiting suffering indiscriminately. It meant acknowledging a reality intelligence agencies had always lived with but rarely articulated. The world does not pause for moral clarity. Decisions are made inside imperfect conditions. London became the reference case because it demonstrated how an adversary's own method could be mirrored at scale. Black Scorpion had never relied on stealth in the traditional sense. He relied on normality. His greatest camouflage was that broken machines are expected to break. Mossad's inversion was equally unglamorous. They did not chase him through streets or storm buildings. They allowed him to walk into an engineered absence. Inside Mossad, Blackout Net was categorized not as a capture operation, but as an environmental interception. That terminology mattered. It shifted emphasis away from individuals and toward systems. Operators were trained to think less about targets and more about flow. How people move through space. How electricity moves through grids. How information moves through bureaucracies. Whoever controls flow controls outcome. Black Scorpion had controlled flow. Then Mossad did. The operation also influenced internal debate about long-term detainees. Keeping a person alive indefinitely outside judicial frameworks created ethical strain even among intelligence professionals accustomed to moral gray zones. There were internal memos arguing for eventual third-country prosecution under sealed proceedings. There were counterarguments emphasizing that any courtroom process risked exposure of tradecraft that protected active operatives. No consensus was reached. The practical solution prevailed. Black Scorpion remained classified, contained, and legally non-existent. Over time, even his custodians changed. New officers inherited a file, not a person. A name on paper. A biometric profile. A list of past debriefings. He became historical data more than human presence. That, too, was a form of disappearance. The networks Black Scorpion had serviced never fully vanished. Networks adapt. They fragment. New intermediaries emerged. But the specific style of infrastructure-assisted assassination that had defined his career declined sharply. It did not disappear entirely. Nothing does. But it lost reliability. Once a method becomes understood, it loses its purity. Security audits across Europe quietly added new checks. Redundant monitoring appeared in substations. Maintenance access logs became more tightly correlated. None of this made headlines. It was invisible hardening. The kind that does not prevent every attack but raises the cost of attempting one. Black Scorpion had thrived in a low-cost environment. Mossad raised the cost. Years later, an Israeli training instructor summarized Blackout Net in a single sentence to a class of new case officers. "We didn't catch a man. We caught a philosophy." That sentence became a slide. The philosophy was simple. Adversaries build identities around what they believe makes them untouchable. That belief becomes a dependency. Dependencies can be mapped. Mapped dependencies can be turned into traps. Black Scorpion believed machines protected him. Mossad used machines to erase him. The story never entered public consciousness because public stories require villains, heroes, and visible conflict. Blackout Net had none of those. It was procedural. Boring. Paper-heavy. Silent. Its success was measured not in explosions avoided or dramatic arrests, but in statistical quiet. Fewer unexplained infrastructure deaths. Fewer accidents involving strategically inconvenient individuals. Analysts track silence. Silence is data. For Black Scorpion's former clients, his disappearance created uncertainty. Contractors who disappear without explanation generate paranoia. Paranoia slows business. Some clients shifted methods. Others paused operations entirely. A few attempted to recruit replacements and failed. None ever publicly asked what happened to him. In their world, asking questions attracts attention. The man himself remained alive somewhere unknown, aging inside controlled environments that never changed. No windows. Regulated light cycles. Scheduled meals. Occasional medical checks. Rare human interaction. Not torture. Not comfort. Stasis. For someone who had spent his life manipulating dynamic systems, stasis was a unique punishment. Mossad never sought to extract confession or remorse from him. Those concepts mattered to courts. They mattered less to intelligence services. What mattered was that a specific class of threat had been neutralized and that its underlying logic had been harvested. Blackout Net did not make the world safer in a grand sense. Intelligence operations rarely do. They shift risk from one shape to another. But it demonstrated something quietly powerful. Control does not always come from imposing force. Sometimes it comes from arranging conditions so that force becomes unnecessary. Black Scorpion had arranged conditions for death. Mossad arranged conditions for disappearance. Between those two approaches lies the real nature of modern covert conflict. Not battles. Not chases. Not cinematic heroism. Systems interacting with systems. People caught inside those interactions. And a reality in which the most decisive moments are often invisible to everyone except those who design them.